We can do it. Yes, we can. We can change things throughout the land, but we all must lend a hand. We can do it. Oh, yes, we can. Oh, your neighbor over there, a bit bewildered, but he cares. He just doesn't know what to do. Join together and then there'll be two. There are others all around, scattered throughout the town. Reach out and you will see your numbers swell to 3. We can do it. Yes, we can. We can change things throughout the land, but we all must lend a hand. We can do it. Oh, yes, we can. Now together.
Well, I was born in Ohio, and my dad was a congregational minister. He had refused to go into the military as a chaplain, and even supported conscientious objectors. So that did make him very popular in rural Ohio. So for the first 5 years of my life, we moved to a different small town every year, where people were looking for a more red-blooded pastor that could support, the war effort. So it was very small towns where there was maybe one red light in the town, one traffic light. And I went to the public school and had some friends that lived just down the street that we had a lot of fun. We didn't even have indoor plumbing in those days. So we had an outhouse out back. A very simple little house. When I went back some years later, it was pretty tiny. And then we actually, for a year, lived right by a lake called Deal Lake. And that was really a tough year for me because I had scarlet fever, which could even be fatal at that time. And also fell out of a tree and broke my leg. So, but the church actually sent me a present every day to open while I had the scarlet fever. And my brother who was younger, kept looking, hoping that he had scarlet fever so he could start getting a present. And when I was 7, our family went to New Mexico on a long camping trip, and where my uncle was working on helping. He was the safety engineer for developing the nuclear bombs in Los Alamos. And so we spent the summer together. It was my first introduction to Native Americans and their powwows, and finding, I think what's called chard, which was old pieces of pottery in the fields. And then after that trip, we moved to Iowa, which was another small town. There was not even paved roads. Again, we had an outhouse. I can especially remember there our garden. My mom loved flowers, and we helped her. That was where I really began enjoying riding my bicycle. My dad and I would go out on long bicycle rides, I suppose a couple miles out in the countryside. And it was while we lived in Iowa, the day before Christmas, that my dad got a call from the American Foreign Service Committee saying that there'd been a war over in Palestine, Israel, and they would like him to go and help distribute food and medicines to refugees over there. And if he could go, he'd need to be on the plane within 2 weeks. So that was quite an amazing experience. I mean, Dad had never been on an airplane, never been out of the United States. I don't think I even knew anybody that had ever been on an airplane. So as our family tried to make decisions together about big things, so Dad really asked us as a family how we felt about him going off for 9 months. And then he, instead of the sermon that Sunday, he asked the church what they thought he should do. And we agreed, and the church agreed. So within 2 weeks, we were all on a train to Ohio, where my brother and my mother and I lived with our grandma in the same house where we lived in Ohio. And my dad went by train on to New York and got the plane to Palestine, and where he was in charge of a refugee camp in Gaza, getting food and medicines, tents for people that had to flee their homes. And it really made a very big impression on me. I was just 7 and 8 for that 9 months that he was gone. He'd given great sermons on loving your neighbor and who is my neighbor, the Good Samaritan story. And he not only gave good sermons, he actually was practicing what he preached. And these people that he had never met needed somebody to help get food and necessary supplies. And he was willing to risk his life to try to help do that. So he was very faithful in writing letters to my brother and me almost every week about what he was experiencing. And of course we felt very lonely without our dad, but we felt very proud that our dad was he was out there loving God's children in another part of the world that really needed care. So one of the experiences there in Gilman, Iowa, this was the name of the small town, I would walk through a park to the school each day. And one day in the winter, walking home, a bunch of boys, I don't know for what was the reason, but they started throwing ice balls at me. And my dad had given a sermon, I think the Sunday or just before that, on loving your enemy. So I thought, well, you know, this really hurts. But how am I to try to love these guys? So I didn't throw anything back, and I said something to the effect, look, I don't have anything against you guys. I'd just like to be your friend. And they threw a few more snowballs, and when they didn't get a response, they quit. And I went home, and from that trip to New Mexico, my most prized possession was a little letter opener with a gem, you know, in it. And I decided to give it to the leader of this group of guys as a way of trying to love them. And my mom was quite upset that I'd given this very precious instrument to these guys that I didn't really even know. But they turned out become very good friends. So at an early age of 7 years old, I discovered that there are other ways to deal with people that are angry or upset or hate you than returning hate for hate. I suppose that my calling in life was decided that day, that cold winter day in Iowa with the guys with the ice balls, that I to try to love my enemies and try to overcome hatred with love, and to try to work for peace and justice in the world. That was a very important instance. Well, when my dad came back in the fall of 1949, when I was 8, our family moved to Pennsylvania, where my dad was offered a job with the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, who had been organizing the work in Gaza and then later in Israel as well. And we lived in a cooperative community called Tangi Homesteads, which was started by people who had been conscientious objectors during the Second World War, and found a sense of community in their life in the CPS camps, and decided they wanted to continue that sense of community. So it was a wonderful place to grow up. There was about 25 families, and really I was welcome in everybody's home, and we helped each other build our homes. We had work days. We played a lot of baseball with the other kids, which was really fun. My brother and I, starting at a very early age, 7th grade, me and my brother, 5th grade, built a barn for our goats and chickens and rabbits, and then built an addition to our own little home. So we learned practical skills very early on. One of the we had some good role models. One of the people in the community actually visited India quite often, a guy named Charlie Walker, and would come back and talk about his conversations with people that had worked very closely with Gandhi. And this was in the early 50s, when it was really a nuclear scare, getting ready for nuclear war. And that was in the days when children were supposed to get under their desks in case of a nuclear blast, etc. Well, there was a Nike missile site just down the road, 3 or 4 miles from our home, from our community. And so, inspired by some of these older folks that I'd gotten to know, I organized a vigil at this Nike missile site over Thanksgiving, where the kids, and I was, I think, 15 at that time, went down. We made signs, vigil at missile site, and fasted over Thanksgiving time, which was kind of a big step for young kids. And some of the kids were as young as 9 or 10. And we spent 2 or 3 days vigiling there at the Nike missile site. And most of those kids have continued to be involved in some way in peace and justice in our lives. My FBI file started there at that Nike missile site. I got my FBI records a few years later, and it starts out, David Hartsough, son of Ray Hartsough, organized this peace vigil at the Nike missile site. And it was quite interesting that they considered that so important. I had the opportunity to go to a Quaker high school, a Westtown school, and I had the opportunity to just meet many what I would call spiritual giants. We had a film called Children of the A-Bomb, where a young woman who had been in Nagasaki at the time of the bombing, and her face was severely disfigured. And she showed this film, which was really so tragic in terms of what had happened to the people there. And afterwards she said, "We of Hiroshima want to make sure that this never happens to anybody else in the world." And that was so impressive to me. Rather than hatred or wanting to get back at this country that had bombed her family and her community and her city, we want to make sure this never happens to anybody else again. And so they're working for the abolition of all nuclear bombs. So inspired by that, we started a public opinion poll, I guess is what we called it, where we would go around door to door just asking people, what do you think about nuclear bomb testing? Just to try to hear what they were thinking, and if they were opposed to nuclear bomb tests, we'd get them to sign a petition to the president, let's stop our bomb testing. I met Bayard Rustin, who worked with Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, who also worked with Martin Luther King in Montgomery, Alabama. A.J. Muste, who was a giant of the peace movement. I got exposed to all these amazing people, and they were a beautiful role model for me. That instead of just growing up and getting a good paying job and building a big, getting a big house and a big car, etc., you could do something with your life to try to help create a better life for all the people on the planet, and certainly all the people in your community and nation. And they were world citizens. Their allegiance wasn't to a country or a football team or just their family. They really saw all people in the world as their brothers and sisters, and were acting on that belief. So risking sometimes their own life or their own jobs, carrying out what they believed in. So and there were Quakers had what they called World Affairs camps and seminars in Washington at the United Nations, where I would get to know other students who were doing something with their lives to try to help create a better world. Again, that was the early 50s, and McCarthyism was very, very strong. People, afraid to kind of step out of the normal, and to have that kind of a community of people that were that I really felt resonance with was very, very supportive. We also went to weekend work camps in Philadelphia, where we helped fix up and paint homes of people living in the poorer ghettos in Philly. And just seeing and getting to know people who our society had discarded. The landlords hadn't fixed their houses in 20 years. The roofs leaked. There was no place for the kids to play. Often no food in the refrigerator. And these were my brothers and sisters too. So that was a part of my learning experience, that this is very unjust. We can't live in a world, in a society that treats each other that way. What I got my fun from was participating in these weekend work camps, getting to go into these seminars and World Affairs camps where we got to go and visit people in the Israeli embassy and the Arab embassies, to the Soviet embassy and the U.S. State Department, and hearing all these different perspectives and realizing that here people are so influenced by who their own nation is. Everybody thinking we are right. And how stupid it is to be preparing for war with one another because we don't like their government or have different perspectives. So at Westtown, I began organizing a morning meditation, organizing a Beliefs into Action group that would meet weekly, and then participating in the going around door to door. We went to demonstrations in Washington, D.C., and went to work camps. And the school, although it was a Quaker school, didn't really fully appreciate all the things that I was doing. And so they penalized me by telling me I couldn't go to the weekend work camps and stuff like that. The headmaster 2 weeks before graduation said, Hartsough, shape up or ship out. And well, that was an invitation to, I shaped up for the last couple of weeks, but I was ready to shape out. And starting that summer, I got to participate in a peace caravan where we went out to Kiwanis clubs and Lions clubs and churches, students from different parts of the world, talking about the need to somehow live in a world where we can live as brothers and sisters. There was a ship called the Golden Rule, which was, there were 4 Quakers who had decided to risk their lives sailing this small boat, the Golden Rule, into the nuclear test area to try to stop the nuclear weapons testing. And each of them wrote a letter saying why they were undertaking this journey. And when I read that, I was just so deeply moved that they cared so deeply about this issue. They're willing to risk their lives to try to stop it. Not hurting anybody else, not going to sabotage the bomb plant or whatever, but risk their own lives by sailing into this testing area. Well, when they were arrested in Hawaii by the U.S. government and were sitting in jail, together with others in Philadelphia, we decided to organize a peace walk from Philadelphia to the United Nations, calling on all nations to stop their nuclear bomb testing. So I recruited other students from Westtown School and other schools to walk that 90 miles or so from Philadelphia to the United Nations. And each night would stay in churches or friends' meeting houses and would talk, often give a public talk about what we were doing, and we talk about the Golden Rule. And really the need for all of us, rather than just sitting back and watching this insanity of preparing for nuclear war, to try to help shift this direction of our nation from Cold War enmity and preparing for hot war to looking at how we could live in a world as brothers and sisters. For most of the walk, well, we had quite a few people starting from Philadelphia, but for a lot of the walk, there were just 20 or 25 people. But by the time we got to New York City, we had hundreds, I suppose close to 500. And I remember we were singing, last night I had the strangest dream as we walked down the street, which went for a couple blocks. And this was the largest demonstration I had ever seen or heard of. And I thought, oh, we can overcome. So at Swarthmore, there were only, I think, 2 or 3 people of color in the student body. And I thought, this is crazy. So one of the things that I did was to try to helped change the admissions policies. So more African American students especially could attend the university. That summer after Swarthmore, I participated in a work camp, and that was 1959, the year of the Cuban Revolution. And the Quakers were organizing a work camp in Oriente Province, in a little village called Barhagua. And that's where a lot of the heavy-duty fighting had taken place. And Bautista, the dictator, had bombed a lot of the homes and the medical center there to try to instill fear, not to challenge his authority. And so what we were doing was rebuilding these homes and also a medical center and putting in a sewage system. This was in an area where it was mostly sugarcane being grown, and the people had 3 months of work a year cutting sugarcane, and they were very poor. And one day, the Sunday, the only day we didn't work, with one of the young boys, I went up onto the hillside, and here's these thousands of acres of sugarcane, and then here was a house with a golden roof in the middle. And I said, "Oh, what is that?" He says, "Well, that's where the American landowner lives." And here are all these folks that were just barely surviving and had great hopes for the Cuban Revolution. There was going to be agrarian reform, and they were going to get a decent life. And my experience of work camps in Philadelphia, in terms of injustice in the United States, this was my first introduction to the tremendous inequality in the world, the great wealth and superabundance in much of the United States. And here we were taking the sugar cane, didn't care about how the people there could live, and large landowners that were making all the profits. And so this was my introduction to the world in which we live, where if we're to have peace or consider ourselves human beings, we've got to really change our relationship, where we can really, where everybody has enough to eat, everyone can have clothing, schools for the children. So that was also very inspiring. Well, when I came back from Cuba, I heard that Howard University was, which was an African-American university in Washington, D.C., was looking for white students to integrate the other way. And I thought, well, instead of trying to get other people to do what I thought they should do, get black students to come to Swarthmore, I should practice what I preach and go to Howard. So that was my inspiration to go to Howard, and both the president and the vice president had been friends of Gandhi, and my dad knew them, and thought, well, this would be a good idea. My mom didn't think that was such a good idea, and but she hated to see her son, quote, give up one of the best schools in the country academically for Howard University. Well, I did go to Howard starting the fall of '59, and it was a very, very important decision for me. Not so much because of the academic study, which, was good. It wasn't like Swarthmore, but because in February of 1960, the 4 students in Greensboro, North Carolina, African-American students, had decided they'd had it up to here with segregation and decided to go to a Woolworth's drugstore sat down at a lunch counter to get something to eat. And instead of getting something to eat, they were arrested and put in jail. And that was kind of a spark which encouraged students all over the South, African American students especially, to go and start challenging segregation in their own communities, mostly at lunch counters. So at Howard, we began, the first week, we just went to picket Woolworths in Washington, D.C., close to Howard University. And then we found out that in Maryland and in Virginia, surrounding Washington, everything was still segregated. Even African ambassadors traveling from New York to Washington through the state of Maryland could not eat along the highways or stay in the motels. So we started going to Maryland to get something to eat on Saturday mornings. And without fail, they would close the lunch counters. This African American friends and me from Howard. They would close the lunch counters, and then we'd hear the police sirens coming, and they would haul us off to jail. And rather than being scared or intimidated, we sang freedom songs all weekend, build our sense of community and our sense of we are a part of a movement where students all over the South are challenging this institution of segregation, which is treating people of color as second-class citizens. You know, the children couldn't go to the amusement parks. The people couldn't go to the theaters, drinking fountains, you know, restaurants, motels. And so Monday morning we'd be released and go back to school until the next Saturday morning. The state of Virginia had passed a law saying anybody that challenged segregation in Virginia could get 6 months in jail and a $500 fine. And so for most of that spring, we kept going to Maryland, where a weekend was much easier. Martin Luther King often came to preach at the chapel at Howard, and it was so inspiring hearing this man who really believed that we could help transform our country into a country of what he called the beloved community, where we could really live as brothers and sisters. And so that gave us great inspiration to continue the sit-ins. Well, in June of 1960, after finishing our final exams, nobody had challenged that segregation law in Virginia. And we decided somebody had to. So we got some additional nonviolence training and got up our courage and went to what was called a People's Drugstore in Arlington, Virginia, and sat down at the lunch counter. And as in Maryland, they closed the lunch counter. They just closed, signed, no food, no drink. And we ended up sitting there for 2 days. And it turned out to be the most challenging 2 days of my life. People came up and called us every name in the book. They put lit cigarettes down our shirts. People punched us in the stomach so hard we'd fall on the floor, and then they would kick us. The American Nazi Party came with their swastikas, and their signs say, "Is we or is we not apes?" And each time that something like this would happen, we would try to respond in a loving, nonviolent way. And toward the end of, which was often pretty challenging, toward the end of the second day, I was meditating on loving your enemies. And I heard this guy come up from behind me, and he says, "If you don't get out of this store in 2 seconds, I'm going to stab this through your heart." And I looked into his face, and his face was contorted with hatred. And I had 2 seconds to decide, do I really believe in nonviolence, or is there a different way to try to deal with this guy? But we'd had a lot of experience, and I just looked at him in the eye, and I said, "Friend, do what you believe is right, but I'll still try to love you." And it was the most amazing thing. His jaw began to drop, and his knife and his hand, which was right at my heart, began to drop, and he left the store. And so for a young 20-year-old, that was a pretty amazing experience about the power of nonviolence. Well, we then did something even more challenging. We went to the front door of that People's Drug Store and read a statement that we had written appealing to the religious and community leaders to use their influence to get the eating facilities open to everyone. And then this was the hard part. We said, if nothing changes within 2 days, within 7 days, we'll be back. And just to think that we could come back and do this again was pretty challenging. Well, some friendly media people got us out of there alive, and back across the bridge back into Washington. And at Howard, we literally shook in our shoes for 6 days, whether we had the courage to go back and do this again. And on the 6th day, we got a phone call that the religious and community leaders had met, had talked with the business leaders, and had gotten a commitment that the eating facilities would be open to everyone within 10 days. Well, that was the most, certainly up until that point, was the most joyful moment of my life. And it was the most important experience of my life, that when something terrible is happening, like segregation, like wars and injustice, instead of cursing the president or the television set or segregation, go find some other people that believe as deeply as you can, as you do about something, and go and challenge it and say, this has to stop. And the whole idea that we can make history. We're not just pawns of some power structure. We can help create a different future. So that's really what my life has been about ever since, inspired by that time at the People's Drug Store in Arlington, Virginia. Stokely Carmichael was one of the students who was often part of our demonstrations at Howard. And we spent, many nights in jail getting to know each other. Many years later, after Stokely, his time in Mississippi and his time all over the South, being treated so meanly, so unjustly, came to really, his words were, hate Whitey. You can't trust Whitey. Well, after I'd moved to California, he came out to speak at La Peña at a cultural center, and I decided to go and hear him, and he gave his talk, and then when he found that I was there, we just wrapped our arms around each other and went to the back of the hall where we're sitting, and had our arms around each other for the rest of the evening. And I was very grateful that somehow our human friendship and what we'd experienced those years together at Howard was stronger than his ideological, hate whitey. And we were both brothers. Many of the people that I was a part of that sit-ins in Maryland and Virginia went on to be on the first freedom rides in the South and spent time in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and went through things that were even more harrowing than my time or our time there in the sit-ins in Maryland and Virginia. But I feel it was such a privilege to get to know these folks and it was very heartening and inspiring for us that we were not just kind of these isolated students at Howard University. We were a part of a movement of people all across the South, led by African Americans and primarily African Americans, who were really trying to create a different kind of world, a different kind of society in the United States.
As your numbers begin to grow, you're expanding what you know. You're a movement when you reach 5, and now watched by the FBI. We can do it. We can do it. Yes, we can. We can change things throughout the land, but we all must lend a hand. We can do it. Oh, yes, we can. Now together.
So instead of going to jail for 6 months, I had the opportunity to go to Yugoslavia, which was a communist country. And these were the people that we were supposed to hate. And I lived with a Yugoslav family, and we came to consider each other brothers, and did a lot of sharing. Got to travel throughout all of what was then Yugoslavia, Sarajevo and Belgrade and Macedonia, Croatia, and it was a wonderful experience. And these were, quote, communists, the folks that my government told me I had to hate. And my friend Tona, about my age, the family I live with, he was a very deeply convinced communist. And he would quote Lenin and Marx and Engels, and I would quote Gandhi very often. But we loved each other, and we got to know each other. And he said at the end of the summer, he said, "David, I hope you're right, that you can convince the wealthy people of the world to share their wealth with everybody. But I want you to know that if you're not successful, we're going to take it. The poor of the world aren't going to put up with this forever." And I've taken that as a challenge for much of my life. Instead of going back to Howard another year, I'd been very inspired by this experience in Yugoslavia, and I had studied German in high school and college, and I thought, I want to go to Berlin. This is the one place in the world where you have these two, the communist world and the capitalist world, threatening war with each other. And I can get to know people on both sides and try to understand how we're going to live in the world together, peacefully. And so I did some intensive additional German study in Cologne, and then went to live the academic year in Berlin, and studied each day I would study in East Berlin and in West Berlin at the two universities, and which was, I think I was the only American that ever had this experience. But I would bicycle through Checkpoint Charlie each day, where there were American tanks facing east, and there were Soviet tanks facing west. And I would ride through Checkpoint Charlie over to the university in East Berlin, the Humboldt University, and got to know the students, and they invited me to start, coming to their classes. And I heard a lot of what I considered communist propaganda. I would challenge some of that propaganda, and they called me a capitalist warmonger. Bicycled back to the west to the Free University, where I'd hear a lot of anti-communist propaganda, and I would challenge that, and they'd call me a communist conspirator. Well, I learned early on that that in both parts of the world, and perhaps in most parts of the world, people are brought up in the schools, in the media, with the government leaders, all from the perspective of, we are superior, we know best. From Berlin, I heard that you could go camping in the Soviet Union, and at that time, I had never heard of the term citizen diplomacy. That just people getting to know each other in the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And so I borrowed some money to buy a VW Bug, and 5 of us went on a 6,000-mile trip through the Soviet Union, camping, getting to know people in the parks, inviting that they would invite us into their homes, the schools. And it was August of 1961 when we were traveling our small VW Bug, and all the Soviet troops and tanks were coming toward Berlin on the 10th or 11th of August. And we had Germans and Americans in our small group. And we didn't know where they were going, but they were going the wrong direction. And it turned out they were going to help build the wall. But at any rate, it was an amazing experience just to get to know these people that our government had said are our enemy, and that our government was preparing to use massive nuclear bombing to prove that we were right, to prove that America, supposedly they were saying this was for defense. But in reality, these caring human beings that we were meeting, who had nothing against the United States, they, as the American people, wanted to live in peace with each other. So that added to my commitment that we've got to find ways other than war and threats of war to live with one another on this planet. And the next year, well, I led 3 groups in the early 60s, 61, 62, and 65, groups of students on similar trips, just to get to know people, and then come back and would speak in churches and Kiwanis clubs and schools about our experience, just from trying to build peace from the bottom up. President Eisenhower had once said, "I'd like to believe that the people of the world want peace so much that governments have to get out of the way and let them have it." And I think that was very smart, and that's what we were trying to do, was to help build understanding of just ordinary people, that we don't have to listen to our governments, that we have to prepare for war, have to spend billions, hundreds of billions of dollars preparing for nuclear Armageddon. We can live together as a human family. Well, in 1962, this was my senior year at Howard, I would go down to the White House every day because several friends of mine were doing a silent fasting and prayer vigil in front of the White House, praying for an end of nuclear bomb testing. And so we'd bicycle down there just to give them some support. And when they were arrested, a couple of us decided we have to take their place. And so we started, a silent prayer vigil in front of the White House. And we ended up getting arrested. We just had simple signs saying bomb tests kill people. But when we had three, it became three of us, they threw us in jail. Well, later that summer, I was in the Soviet Union, and I felt the need, we had to end nuclear bomb tests somehow, whether it was the United States or the Soviet Union or both, somewhere had to stop. So I decided, together with another fellow that was in my group, to do the same demonstration in Moscow in front of the Kremlin. So we decided that we also needed to have a demonstration in Red Square, challenging the Soviets to stop nuclear bomb testing. So we made a sign in Russian, "Bomb tests kill people." And we placed ourselves right next to the Lenin Mausoleum in front of the Kremlin. And people came up and said, "Well, why are you demonstrating for peace here in Russia? Our bombs are just peaceful bombs. They're to defend our country. Go and demonstrate in the United States." And we said, "Well, we did demonstrate in the United States, and they told us to go to Russia. And somebody's got to stop this insanity." Well, I had helped organize the San Francisco to Moscow Peace March the year before. So we had a lot of leaflets in many languages, why stop nuclear bomb testing. And we're handing those out. And the police came up with this crowd of people surrounding us and said, "You've got to stop this demonstration against our peaceful bomb tests, or you get 20 years in prison." And we kind of gulped, and I talked with Paul, the other fellow that was doing this with me, and we said, "Well, thank you for warning us, but if the U.S. and the Soviet Union continue this nuclear arms race and have a nuclear war, it's going to be much worse than 20 years in prison." And we did demonstrate in the United States. I spent time in jail, and we're appealing to the Soviets to take the first step to stop this insanity. Well, he said, "We've got to talk with our superiors." And they left. We continued for another couple hours and went back to our campsite. And luckily, we didn't have to spend the 20 years in prison. Well, that same year, I also had the opportunity to, with a group of Quakers, to meet with President Kennedy in the White House. And we were talking about how can we learn to live together on the planet, in peace. And we were, first of all, quite impressed that the president was actually sitting in this little circle in the Oval Office, he in his rocking chair, listening to us. He wasn't just pontificating, he was the president of the United States. And he said, "I've been reading The Guns of August, how before the First World War, everyone was arming to the teeth to try to avoid that war. And that's exactly what got them into it. And he said it's scary how similar the situation is now. This is 1962, shortly before the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the same thing could happen again. Well, we, among other things, encouraged, this was when there was famine in China. People were dying of starvation. And the United States was spending millions, hundreds of millions of dollars storing food in silos in Kansas. And we said, well, why don't we share some of this food that is rotting in silos with the Chinese? He says, you mean you want us to feed the enemy? And we said, yeah, that's exactly what we mean. I challenged him or I encouraged him to challenge the Soviets to a peace race. And he said, you know, the military-industrial complex is very strong in this country. And if you're serious about this, you're going to have to build a much more powerful movement to make it possible for me to take that kind of leadership. Well, after 35 minutes or so, his secretary came and said, Mr. President, your next appointment is here. And he said, tell him to wait. I'm learning something from these Quakers. And that was an affirmation. But at any rate, I think we both had our marching orders. He heard from us, we've got to take some significant steps away from this nuclear arms race, this Armageddon. And I think put the spark in his mind of, what if we were to challenge the Russians to a peace race, which he did, a year later, and we heard our marching orders. We've got to go out and build a powerful movement to support the president in taking this kind of leadership. I graduated from Howard in '62, and actually had my arrest at the White House was just before, and I was afraid I might be in jail for graduation. So I made my one phone call to the vice president saying, look, it may be that I am not going to make it to graduation. And he said, well, I will make an announcement that you're in jail for opposing the bomb test, and pick up your diploma for you. But luckily I was released and got to graduate with the rest of my class from Howard University. The only white person in the graduating class that year, by the way. And then I led another group to Russia that summer. Well, the following summer, in 1963, was the March on Washington, where people from all over the South and people from all over, especially the eastern coast of the United States, came to Washington for this massive march for jobs and freedom. And instead of the 500 or so that we had in New York on the Peace Walk, there were about 250,000 people on a very, very hot day. And Peter, Paul, and Mary, and Joan Baez, and John Lewis, so many inspiring singers and speakers. And then toward the end of the afternoon, Martin Luther King gave his inspiring talk on sharing with us his dream. And that was another highlight of my life. Not only King's, what he shared, and the spirit and the love and his determination and his faith that we're going to actually make this happen, but the 250,000 people that were there and who were committing to work to help make this dream reality. And I remember Byard Rustin, who I'd gotten to know as a high school student, up there at the end, asking people to make a commitment to work in their schools and their churches and their communities to make these changes. And at the end of each thing, everybody would say, "I do," or "I will." And in a sense, we can create this beloved community that the King had shared his dream about. Well, Ralph Abernethy, who had worked with Martin Luther King, stayed in our home at Tangay Homesteads. And he said this was the first white home he'd ever slept in. And he said to my dad, "Well, why don't you bring the boys down to Montgomery, Alabama?" This is 1956, during the Montgomery bus boycott. And they can learn about what we're doing down there. And so during spring vacation, we drove down to Montgomery, Alabama. And here I'd grown up in this integrated, intentional community where we all, treated each other as friends. And here in the Deep South, everything was as segregated as you could imagine. And the blacks were kind of one step up from slavery. And here were people, the whole African American community had decided we're not going to ride the buses on a segregated basis. And we're walking to work each day. And we're, even when black churches were bombed by some of the white racists, they were not saying we're going to get back and bomb the white churches. They were saying we're going to just continue our struggle for dignity, and we're going to do it nonviolently. And this was the first. My folks, when I was a kid, had given me the book by Mahatma Gandhi, All Men Are Brothers, and this had inspired and planted the seeds into me about nonviolence as a way of life and a way of struggle. But here were a whole community of people using nonviolent means to challenge the inhumanity of segregation. And I remember going to one of the black churches, and all that was left was the splinters of the pews, and the cross was on its angle up front. And thinking, how could white Christians do this to black Christians? Because they happen to be the wrong color. And anyway, that planted seeds, not only meeting Martin Luther King. I was 15, he was 25 or 6, something like that. 7, maybe. But that whole community of people challenging the injustice of segregation in that community was very important in my growth of understanding about the power of nonviolence. It was not just an idea, it could become a movement. Well, after graduating from Howard and taking another group to Russia that summer, I actually spent a good deal of time taking slides from my trips in the Soviet Union around to churches and high schools and colleges, speaking, sharing some of those experiences of the humanity of these people that were preparing to kill. And I decided to do my alternative service as a conscientious objector with the Friends Committee on National Legislation, which is a Quaker lobby group in Washington, D.C. And they freed me up to go out and speak at colleges and churches and Quaker meetings about the state of the world and the need to get more actively involved in helping change the world. I had decided, inspired by some people I knew, that I could not pay taxes for war. And 50% of our taxes go to wars and preparations for wars. So for some years early in my life, I decided to live on a non-taxable income, which was $600 a year at that time. So $50 a month was living pretty simply, but at least I didn't have to pay for the nuclear weapons and for the wars and bombs and nuclear military bases around the world. Well, and I obviously got to meet all kinds of very interesting people as I traveled, especially all over the East Coast and the Western and the Midwest. Well, my last job doing my alternative service was in August of 1964. And this is when the President Johnson, had said, our Navy ships have been attacked by the North Vietnamese and in the Gulf of Tonkin. And this was kind of the excuse to massively escalate the war in Vietnam. Well, my job was to try to call over the Pentagon and get more information about this, which we could then tell Congress before they voted on the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which essentially was a blank check to the president to do whatever he wanted. Well, I would call one person after another in the Pentagon to say, we need more evidence, what happened and how it happened, et cetera. And what were our Navy ships actually doing there? In these waters just off the coast of North Vietnam. And nobody would answer my questions, but they would say, try to call so-and-so. For 2 days, I kept calling one person after another. And toward the end of the second day, I finally got a general in the Pentagon, and I asked him my questions. And he put me on hold and called another general, and for some reason I could hear their conversation. And he said, General, this guy Hartsough has been calling over here to the Pentagon the last 2 days, and his questions are of more than just passing interest. And if I had anything to say about this, I'd draft him and send him over to Nam. Well, I was hearing this whole thing, and then he got back on the phone with me and said, sorry, I don't have the information. Can't answer those questions. Well, Congress then voted for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution because all they'd heard was the lies, which later, was proved they were lies, and it was the excuse to start bombing of North Vietnam, and I sincerely believe that if we'd actually gotten answers to those questions and got that information to Congress, they would not have signed that blank check. And the millions of people, millions of Vietnamese people, the 58,000 American soldiers that died in the war, and more than that committed suicide when they came home, and the hundreds of billions of dollars that the United States spent on that war could have been saved. But anyway, so that was my contribution as a conscience objector was to try to save us from that madness of going into that war, which was insane from the perspective of of national defense, of what has anything to do with security for the Americans. What are we doing, 10,000 miles from home bombing some country because we don't like their government. After graduating from Howard and doing my alternative service at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, I just decided I wanted to do some graduate work in international relations. And my goal was, I've learned firsthand what these conflicts look like in Cuba, in Yugoslavia, in Berlin, in the Soviet Union. And my hope in graduate school was to have a better understanding of how can we resolve these conflicts without going to war and without resorting to killing each other. Well, I got a scholarship to go to Columbia University, and where I wrote papers on how can, this is 1964 and 5 and early 6, on how we could peacefully resolve our conflicts with Cuba, how we could end the Vietnam War. And I wrote these papers, and the university was publishing the papers of all the guys that were writing stuff about how to win the Cold War with the Soviet Union, but mine they didn't want to touch. Well,